everyone. Fear lived under the bed. Olga and I have been friends since school. Then they entered higher education and got married. Olya's rich parents, when she became pregnant, gave her a 3-room apartment, so to speak, as a kick into the future. A wonderful boy was born. They named him Vitaly in honor of Olga's grandfather. We affectionately called him Vitka. When the baby was 1 year old, Olya and her husband moved into a renovated new apartment for a happy life for their young family. But the baby immediately began to get sick there often, be capricious, and cry. Later, the hysterics reached the point where the child somehow climbed over his crib and ran to his parents in the bedroom. Olya complained that now they had no peace from their son. He didn't want to stay in the room at all. At his grandparents', Vitka was a completely normal child, but at home, it was as if he had been replaced. One day, the mother gave the baby markers and paper while she was preparing lunch. She had to entertain her son. When I came to look, I was horrified. My son very clearly drew a man sitting under the bed. The entire sheet was drawn with black lines mixed with yellow and red. Vitka couldn't really explain what he had drawn. He said the word uncle and pointed under the bed. So a year passed. Psychiatrists said that the child had watched enough TV and was simply projecting his fears onto the dark corners of the house. But the boy was restless. At night, he steadily ran to his parents and lay down between them. He had already begun to speak quite well and was constantly complaining about some guy in the dark corners. Psychologists and psychiatrists unanimously argued that the boy sees negativity on TV from the world around him. But, naturally, neither specialists nor parents wanted to believe in mysticism. The mothers were ordered to use any means necessary to wean the child from the... And so Olga took the extreme step. I read somewhere on the internet that the child was put down and locked up. He cried, and then got tired and fell asleep. After talking with the child that there was no uncle, that he had invented everything, she went out the door without turning off the nightlight and locked the boy. It was quiet for about 20 minutes, but then the boy started crying. Olga was tormented, but somehow the child had to be weaned off. With tears in her eyes, Olga sat and waited for the baby to calm down and fall asleep, but Vitka started shouting. Thinking that the neighbors would now come running to argue, the mother opened the room. The son was sitting on the windowsill, pressed against the glass. His eyes were wet and he was sobbing nervously. And there were fresh bruises on my son's arms and legs. Stuttering, the child continued to say that a scary guy was crawling out from under the bed and wanted to bite him and drag him with him. The mother, exhausted by her son's phobias, ran with the boy to the doctors again the next morning. Vitka saw nothing but the cartoons that his parents took away from his son. He also did not look at the scary pictures. Where did this terrible fear come from in the child's head? The doctors were already throwing up their hands. Some believed that the parents beat the baby, but he said that mom and dad never hit him. Neighbors described the family as positive. In general, there was no evidence other than bruises. Mom and baby went to a sanatorium to relax for a week. There the boy was calm and slept on his own, without screams or scandals. Upon arrival, everything resumed again, and then Olga couldn't stand it. She, on the advice of an elderly neighbor, called to bless the apartment. The priest who came immediately said that they lived in an unclean place, and that the boy must be taken care of. After he left, it was a calm evening, and there were no signs of trouble. Olga was preparing to welcome her husband back from a business trip. She put her son in her bedroom, and she prepared food. It was late. When she discovered that there was not enough flour, she ran out to the neighbors. After talking a little, everyone suddenly heard an inhuman, terrible scream, and then silence. Olya and her neighbors quickly went up to their apartment. What the mother saw left a deep imprint on her entire life. Her little son lay on the bed, arms outstretched, bites all over his body, eyes rolled back in horror. Running up to the child, the mother discovered that the boy was not breathing. The examination found multiple human bites on the baby's body. They conducted an examination, which concluded that the parents were completely innocent in his death, and the woman had an alibi. The boy screamed precisely when she was talking to the neighbors upstairs. This case was placed as uninvestigated in secret documents, and the source of the bites has not yet been determined. Then Olya and her husband told me in great confidence that they had found out about the apartment. About 10 years ago, a man who was accused of pedophilia shot himself in it, and in order to avoid punishment and trial, and then torment in prison, he decided to shoot himself just before his arrest. Olya now believes in mysticism. She has not found other explanations for the death of her child. The police did not find any of them either. Every day my friend cries for the baby. They sold the ominous apartment, and they sold it to people who did not have children. Story 2. Mental hospital. I'm 15 years old, and my name is Elia. In general, my dad died when I was 7 years old, and since then my mother started drinking. I ran away from home because my mother blamed me for my father's death, beat me. She and I didn't get along well with each other. Money in our family there wasn't, because my mother drank everything away. And so I often skipped school to earn some money. My dad was a photographer, and I took his camera and went to abandoned buildings, to the cemetery, catacombs, in which there was usually something scary and mysterious. I liked it, and the pictures didn't turn out bad, and I could make some money from it. Strangely enough, I wasn't scared or creepy, but on the contrary, I felt good and comfortable in these scary places, and when I skipped school again, I went to the old psycho hospital, Colchester. This hospital opened in 1913. This hospital could accommodate about 2,000 people. Patients were constantly brought here from the most remote corners, and despite this, the hospital was rarely filled. The reason for this is the death of patients. As it turned out later, in this center for mental health care, experiments were carried out on patients, after which, often, death occurred. Within the walls of this institution, therapies using electric shock were carried out, and lobotomy was very popular, especially popular in 1950. It's sad, but such treatment methods were used even for teenage moodiness. A friend told me about it. Since this psychiatric hospital was quite far from home, it took me more than 6 hours to get there. I decided to quickly take a photo of everything and leave here. When I approached the hospital, there were huge rusty gates and a sign with the name of the hospital. Due to the fact that the paint was almost worn off, I couldn't really read the name, and the thickets blocked almost the entire sign. Well, I didn't look at those gates for a long time and decided to climb over. And when I climbed over, I felt somehow uneasy. Even though this had never happened before, there were a couple of benches in the courtyard of the hospital, maybe more than that. Everything was just overgrown with grass, and there was nothing visible except it. I took a couple of pictures and decided to go into the building. I went up the steps and tried to open the door, but unfortunately it was locked. I walked away from the door and looked around the building, in the hope that I would find windows without bars, but the open window was only on the 4th floor. I was already disappointed to enter the building. But as a friend, something forced me to open the door again, and this time the door opened with ease. I thought that perhaps I had loosened it the first time, and it just opened. I tried to convince myself. As soon as I went inside, I smelled rot. It felt like someone just forgot to throw away the missing meat. It smelled terrible. I didn't pay attention to it. You never know what could have died here. I took a couple of pictures and decided to go up to the floor. And as soon as I found myself on the 2nd floor, strange voices began to appear downstairs. They were saying something, but it was difficult for me to make out. I thought it was the guards or the police, and I decided to hide, because my mother would have killed me if she had found out what I do. On the 2nd floor there was only a corridor, so you can't hide anywhere, and I quietly went to the 3rd floor while taking pictures. When I found myself on the 3rd floor, I could say I was in shock. The voices became close, very close. That's the feeling that someone near me said. I rushed to the 4th floor, because I decided that those people followed me and found out that I was already here. When I went upstairs, I saw a straight corridor and walked along it. There were a couple of doors, orange walls, and one window, without bars. I looked out the window and couldn't believe my eyes. There were no thickets. And those rusty gates, beautifully painted, lawn, 6 benches, and the worst thing is that more than 1,000 people are standing on the street, in white pajamas, and looking at me. I moved away from the window in fright. I decided to run to the people on the 1st floor, because I was already going crazy. But turning my head towards the stairs, I saw about 20 people, maybe more. They were also in dressing gowns, but their skin was burned off, and the scalpel was removed from their head. The words "jump" came out of their mouths, and they were approaching me. Looking closely, I saw that each of them had a sickle, a knife, a scalpel in their hands. I didn't know what to do. Was it all true? This is happening to me, but I knew that I couldn't stand still, and so I decided to jump from the 4th floor. And I did it when one of these idiots swung a sickle at me. He cut my leg, and I fell. Silence, terrible pain in my leg. My body just hurt like horror. It's beyond words. It was impossible to breathe. And I thought that this was the end. I closed my eyes. Then, some kind of flash of light flashed before my eyes. I ended up outside the gates of the hospital. I stood up and saw that it was already night. I took my phone and looked at the time. It showed 3:06. I didn't know what happened, but I really wanted to go home. I looked at my leg. A huge cut. But it didn't hurt. My body didn't hurt. I don't know how, but after a couple of minutes I found myself in front of my house. I decided that because of the concussion my memory was being lost. I took out my phone. The time was 3:07. There was no date, no network. I thought that when I fell, I broke the phone and that's why there was no time or date. I looked closer and saw a police car, walked up to the threshold of my house, and saw my mother crying. I stood next to her, trying to tell her that I was here. Mom, I'm here. Come on, tell me don't be. Well, don't shut up. I tried to tell her, but she didn't seem to hear. I didn't understand what was happening, and I saw an officer approaching my mother. I tried to turn to him, but he didn't hear me either. And then he started telling my mother, "Your daughter was found at the Colchester Asylum. She is dead." To tell her, but she didn't seem to hear. I didn't understand what was happening, and I saw an officer approaching my mother. I tried to turn to him, but he didn't hear me either. And then he started telling my mother, "Your daughter was found at the Colchester Asylum. She is dead." But how? What happened to her? A scalpel was removed from her, and a strong electric shock was given to her, and we don't know how to explain it, but her spine was broken and a couple of ribs. I couldn't believe my ears. How? I'm alive. I'm still here. Hey, can you hear me? And at that moment, I found myself in the hospital. In that damned hospital, I was tied on some table. 3 people in white coats stood next to me and discussed how best to cut my skull. And now, since 1971, this torment is daily for me.